usually what we see is people telling us, no, you have to stick to your decisions and you have to stick to only way of being and existing and thinking in order
Yeah,
to succeed, right? Have you seen that?
exactly.
And it's very different from the fact that you're presenting to us that no, actually being able to switch and change between decisions and between pressure times is actually very important for our mental health. Is that it?
It's really important, yeah, because I think we all know, and all of us ourselves can end up getting very stuck in habits, if you like. We get very rigid in how we think and how we feel, and often I'm sure all of us have had that experience of you're trying to solve some problem, and you keep trying the same thing over and over again, and it's just not working. The outcome is the same every time. So sometimes it's you look at the world around you and you realize actually there's a different way of doing this. Maybe my family have always done things in a certain way. Maybe I've always done certain things in a certain way. But sometimes that may not be the right way. And that's what Switchcraft is about, really. It's about saying, stepping back a bit and really looking at the situation you're in and finding out what is the best thing to do in that situation. And it may not be comfortable for you. It may be something you're not particularly comfortable doing. But I kind of discovered that in a lot of research, that sometimes some people were very good at identifying when they needed to change and do something different, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. And the important thing about Switchcraft is it's not just changing for the sake of changing. It's not just
Yeah.
changing because you can change. It's changing when it's appropriate to the situation. That's really the key. So I give an example in the book of golf. So I don't know whether people play golf a lot in Brazil, but we all know that when you see people going out onto the golf course, they have about 14 different clubs, different types of clubs. And that's because the challenges they face on different parts of the golf club are quite different. Sometimes they'll have to hit very long shots. Sometimes they'll be stuck in a bunker and they'll have to have a particular type of club to get out of that. Sometimes they're in rough grass. So you need lots of different clubs. If you had one club only, you'd be very good at certain types of shots, but really bad at all the other types of shots.
Really?
Yeah, so I kind of use that analogy to say it's a bit like that in life, really. We all have lots of different strategies, and we might have our preferred strategies and preferred ways of doing things. But actually, life throws us lots of very different types of problems. So the idea that only one solution is going to be good for everything it just doesn't work. So even though in psychology we've got a lot of very good evidence-based techniques, so we've got things like mindfulness, growth mindset. I'm sure your audience know a lot of these things. And all of these have a lot of evidence, but none of them are good for every single situation you're likely to be in. Some of them are very good, like mindfulness can be very good when you want to regulate your emotions, control your emotions, calm yourself a bit. But there are some situations where it's absolutely the wrong choice. So that's really what Switchcraft is about. It's about you're really understanding that there is no one size fits all. I don't know whether that's a phrase in English. I'm not sure whether you have it in Brazil, but
Yeah.
it's the idea that like no one size fits everything. So, and I think that's really, we sometimes forget that, and we often are trying to look for the one secret or the one technique that's going to solve all our problems. And the argument I make in the book really is that actually there isn't one. What we need is kind of a diversity of mind, if you like, lots of different strategies, lots of different ways of dealing with situations, and then developing that technique of picking the right one for the right context you're in. So when people are very anxious, we know they tend to pay more attention to negative information. They zone into the negative stories in the newspaper, for example. Also, if you have in the social world, we have lots of ambiguities. People might make a comment about something, and it's very easy to interpret that in a more negative way or a more positive way. So again, anxious people tend to have very negative biases there. So if something is ambiguous, they'll always take the worst case scenario, they'll take a more negative scenario. And the same in memory. When we recall things that happened in the past, people who are prone to anxiety and depression will tend to remember more negative material than more positive material. So, I fell into the trap myself of thinking a bit rigidly, because for many years, I was working for years and years on this, looking at attentional biases and negative cognitive biases, and thinking this is the problem with anxiety. People have this negative biases. So we developed a lot of computerized training techniques to try and shift those biases. And that we have some evidence that if you shift a negative bias, you get improvements in anxiety. So what I kind of realized was that when we started looking at this, with anxious people, it turns out that it wasn't the negative bias itself that was the problem, really. It was the inflexibility of the bias. So what happens is, for most of us, we can get a very negative bias in a threatening situation. But when we're in a safe situation, when we're with our friends or we're at home or we're within a familiar, safe kind of environment, those biases get switched off and we can relax and we're not necessarily thinking negatively. But the problem with anxious people is that they have these negative biases when there's a threatening situation. But the problem is they also have these biases when they're in a very safe situation. So in other words, I suddenly realized it's actually the inflexibility of the biases is the problem, not the biases itself. These biases are actually quite functional and they work well for us in certain situations. But for anxious people, they just can't switch them off, really.
What people actually ask me all the time, because I work with emotion and cognitive regulation, because so they ask me constantly, what's the best technique for depression? What's the best technique for, I don't know, for doing a test? Or, and then
Yes,
also I always say there is no best technique for anything. It depends on so many things, on who you are, how you react.
absolutely.
We actually
Absolutely.
have to know about how you, and then you have to develop a flexible way of being. And that's what the book's about, right? You teach, like, it's kind of a method. Can we call it because the name of the book in Portuguese is Method, the method switch. That's
Okay,
it.
yeah, exactly. And I think it is. So I try to give lots of tips and lots of techniques of how to switch and how to improve your flexibility in those different types of things. Like sometimes it's emotional flexibility, sometimes it's a more cognitive type of flexibility, a switching mindset very quickly. So I give a few different techniques and methods to help people do that.
How do you think dealing with uncertainty is actually important to be flexible?
It's really, really important, and I think it's kind of really at the heart of switchcraft, really, because if you think about it, the world is very uncertain, and it always has been. We feel a lot of people feel things are more uncertain now after the coronavirus pandemic and everything. But actually, if we think back through our ancestors, many generations have had wars, they've had earthquakes, there's all sorts of uncertainty. And even in our personal lives, we never quite know if friends are going to get ill, if we're going to get ill, things would happen. We might lose our job. All sorts of things can happen. So I think the first thing is to really kind of, I suppose, try and develop a sense of acceptance. So this is actually normal. It's not, I think we often think of uncertainty as, oh, this is, for example, as you know, Fran, I'm in a university here in Adelaide at the moment, and we're going through a merger with another university that's kind of more or less next door. And of course, a lot of people are very resistant to that change. Suddenly, we've got these two very different universities that are now kind of joining together. And it's created a lot of uncertainty. No one really quite knows how it's going to work out. So I think, first of all, just kind of almost accepting, well, this is just normal life. Life is always changing. We never quite know, when things are going to change. So we can't really expect things to stay the same for all of our lives. Even over a year or two, things will change. So that kind of acceptance to really kind of allow yourself to feel that uncertainty and almost to kind of normalize it is kind of really important, I think. The uncertainty isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it can even be simple things like trying some unusual foods you've never tried before, maybe, and you might just think, oh, I can't try that because it's different. I'm going to get ill if I try that. And actually, maybe you go in, you might really enjoy it, So I think just trying to be more flexible and be more open-minded, really, and more curious about the world. But also, as we said at the beginning, just kind of normalizing the thing that uncertainty isn't something unusual. It's something, it's always there. It always has been there. And it's just something, it's part of being human, and it's part of how we have to learn to cope with the world, really. So let's imagine you have a situation like, maybe you'd arranged to meet a friend and she never turned up, or she didn't return your call or something like that. You might think, oh, she doesn't like me anymore. She's not interested. But actually, a little exercise is to try and come up with one or two different interpretations of what happened. And it may be the case that actually maybe she was really busy. Maybe, she was so busy she just simply forgot and there was nothing more than that. Or it may be, but maybe some relative of hers is seriously ill and she was very distracted and just got distracted by that. So a good exercise is to think back on something that happened that upset you in some way, or made you angry in some way, or upset you, and just try and come up with another alternative explanation that's a plausible explanation, and then maybe come up with a third explanation. And by gradually trying to come up with different interpretations of things that happened, I think it does two things. First of all, it allows you to realize that actually your first interpretation isn't necessarily the right one. But also, by trying to come up with these different interpretations, you're really training yourself to be more mentally flexible, because you're actually training yourself to think about different interpretations and different perspectives. And that's really teaching you, as you say, that there isn't only one way. Like maybe your interpretation was right, it could be right, but actually maybe it isn't. That, and just thinking of different possibilities is always a really good thing to just keep your mind kind of more active and your brain more active.